September 17th, 1843. Prince George's County, Maryland. The air is thick with late summer heat, the kind that clings like sweat against cloth. The ground is cracked, dry at the edges. But inside the chapel, the smell is damp, cedar wood planks absorbing centuries of breath. A bell swings, heavy iron against the sky, calling planters and families into rows of benches. Men walk with swagger, boots pressing dust into the wooden threshold. Their names fall heavy in the silence. Elijah Carter, James Holloway, Rufus Boyd, Daniel Pike, John Travis, Caleb Boone, Nathaniel Reeves, Samuel Drake, Thomas Ewing, Gideon Hall, William Ricks. 11 names, 11 men, and then unseen but always present, the one who moves behind them. Harriet, the slave Harriet, 27 years old, scar tissue along the ridge of her left hand from years of chopping roots, the faded burn across her forearm from lifting a kettle too heavy for a child. Her body small, wiry, but muscles coiled tight like the ropes that bound her. Her eyes lowered when spoken to, but never lowered in her own heart. She walks softly across the chapel floor, cloth dress brushing the splinters. She carries trays. She carries bread. She carries cups of cider that glisten in the light of the stained glass window. She doesn't cry. She never cries. She just moves. They say she was born for labor, born to serve, born to kneel. But Harriet knows the truth. She was born with memory. Memory of screams in the night. Memory of chains biting skin. Memory of a mother's voice singing hymns to keep children from despair. And memory never dies. The chapel that day smells of starch, tobacco, sweat, candle wax. The sound of hymns echoes against the rafters. Voices rising to a God they claim belongs only to them. Outside, cicadas sing in the heat. Inside, the silence between prayers feels like a blade waiting to fall. Harriet has worked this chapel before. She has scrubbed its floors, scrubbed until her knuckles bled into the wood. She has washed the pews where these men now sit. She has polished their boots, fetched their coats, bent her back until the world blurred. But on this Sunday, the work is not the same. The knife in the kitchen is not for meat. The pestle grinding herbs is not for healing. The cups of cider are not for thirst. They are for something else. She moves past the pew where Elijah Carter sits, his gold pocket watch gleaming, his hand heavy with rings. He is whispering to James Holloway about the harvest, about tobacco prices, about the Negro stock he plans to sell. They call it business. They call it profit. But it is blood. Always blood. She remembers Daniel Pike laughing as he struck a boy across the face last winter, the boy no older than 14. She remembers John Travis pulling her sister Lydia by the arm into the smokehouse, Lydia returning hours later with eyes hollowed out. She remembers Caleb Boone dragging her father, Josiah, into the fields and beating him until he could not rise. Josiah never recovered. He died coughing blood into the earth. She remembers. She remembers every name, every act. But still Harriet is silent. She pours cider into their cups. The liquid swirls, amber against the rim. The men don't notice her hands trembling. They don't notice the small pouch of ground leaves tucked into her apron. They don't notice anything at all, because they have never seen her as human. They see her only as a shadow, a tool, a servant. And sometimes the shadow watches more clearly than the light. The service begins. The preacher raises his voice, calling for repentance, calling for mercy. Harriet listens to the words, mercy, forgiveness, grace. She wants to laugh, but her lips remain closed. Forgiveness was not given to her people. Mercy was not given to Lydia. Grace was not given to Josiah. Forgiveness is for the powerful. Memory is for the broken. She stands at the back of the chapel, trays balanced in her arms, eyes cast down but ears open. The voices of the planters rise in hymn. Amazing grace. The irony cuts sharper than any whip. Harriet grips the tray. Her pulse matches the beat of their voices. The day outside burns with heat. Inside, the chapel grows darker as clouds slide across the sun. Shadows lengthen. The hymn ends. The preacher's voice lowers into prayer. Heads bow, hands clasp, silence stretches, and Harriet knows the silence will break. She didn't plan this overnight. No, the planning took months. It took patience. It took gathering small scraps of knowledge, small handfuls of herbs from the edges of the woods. Foxglove, nightshade, Jimson weed. Plants the masters ignored, but Harriet studied. She learned from an old woman once, a healer among the enslaved, a woman named Hester, who whispered to her, The plants that heal can also kill. Remember, child, remember. And Harriet remembered. She ground the leaves late at night when the others slept. She mixed powders in the dark, hiding them in folds of cloth. She carried them, always waiting for the right moment. And now, this Sunday morning, September 17th, 1843, was the moment. She looks at the men again. Elijah Carter, James Holloway, Rufus Boyd, Daniel Pike, John Travis, Caleb Boone, Nathaniel Reeves, Samuel Drake, Thomas Ewing, Gideon Hall, William Ricks. 11 names. 11 waits. 11 graves waiting to be dug. The preacher speaks of sacrifice. The preacher speaks of Christ's blood spilled for the salvation of men. Harriet listens. She does not bow her head. Her blood has already been spilled. She does not need salvation. She needs justice. And as the men reach for their cups, as the amber cider touches their lips, Harriet feels the first breath of freedom stir inside her chest, because she knows this is not just cider. This is memory ground into powder. This is silence transformed into poison. This is Harriet's voice, spoken not with words but with fire hidden in the bloodstream. The chapel has never been so still, not because of God's presence, but because Harriet is here. Memory is not kind. Memory doesn't fade for those who suffer. For Harriet, memory is sharper than iron, heavier than chains. Memory whispers to her in the dark, speaks to her when she works, crawls into her chest when she tries to rest. She remembers the beginning. She was born in 1816, on a wet morning in May, inside a one-room cabin at Carter Plantation. Rain hammered the tin roof. Her mother, Ruth, lay on a straw pallet, her face twisted with pain, her cries muffled because overseers hated noise. The midwife, an old enslaved woman named Dinah, whispered prayers under her breath, calling on ancestors whose names had already been stolen. Harriet came into the world with fists clenched, screaming. Dinah lifted her, wiped her skin with cloth and whispered, "Child, you will carry fire." Ruth kissed her baby's forehead and wept. From the very beginning, Harriet was told, "You belong to them. Not to your mother, not to your kin, not to yourself. You are property. You are ledger entries in a book kept by Master Elijah Carter." She never forgot the way his voice sounded when he counted heads, the way a man counts cattle. Her earliest memories are of the kitchen, heat, smoke, the sting of wood ash in her eyes. At 6 years old, she was too small for the fields, so they made her fetch water, stir pots, wash rags. She remembers the smell of fat boiling, onions frying, blood draining from slaughtered pigs. She remembers knives bigger than her arms, grinding stones that made her wrists ache. The kitchen was supposed to be a place of nourishment. But to Harriet it was chains disguised as work. Ruth, her mother, was always near, moving like a ghost between chores. Ruth's eyes were soft, voice hushed, hands strong enough to pull Harriet close and whisper, "Endure, child, endure." But endurance has a cost. Ruth's back bore the marks of lashes, long ropes of scar tissue where flesh had been torn open. Harriet never forgot the first time she saw her mother whipped. She was 7. She hid behind the smokehouse wall and peeked through the cracks as Elijah Carter ordered Ruth tied to the post. She had dropped a jug of milk. Just milk, and for that the lash sang. Ruth didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just endured. Harriet remembered every sound of leather striking flesh. Then there was Josiah, her father. Tall, proud, shoulders broad from years in the fields. He taught Harriet small things when the masters weren't looking. How to plant seeds in hidden corners. How to listen to the night sounds, owls, crickets, wolves, and understand them. How to keep words tucked inside where no one could steal them. But Josiah was broken slowly, piece by piece. Caleb Boone, the overseer, hated him, hated his strength. One night, when Josiah refused to reveal which enslaved man had stolen extra corn, Boone dragged him into the dirt and beat him with a hickory cane until the bones in his hand snapped. Harriet watched from the cabin, Ruth's arms around her shoulders, both of them trembling. Josiah never healed. His cough deepened, blood flecking his lips. He died when Harriet was 12. She buried his memory in her chest. And then Lydia, her sister. Beautiful Lydia, 2 years younger, hair thick and black, smile bright even in darkness. Lydia was Harriet's other half, the one who sang at night when Harriet could not. Lydia hummed spirituals, tapping rhythms on the cabin wall, whispering, One day we will be free. One day. But freedom was a dream too costly. When Lydia turned 15, John Travis noticed her. The plantation men noticed too much. Harriet remembers the night Lydia was taken into the smokehouse. She remembers the muffled cries, the silence afterward. Lydia came back pale, eyes hollowed like a tree struck by lightning. After that, Lydia was never the same. 2 years later, she was gone, sold to a plantation farther south. Harriet never saw her again, but she remembered. She remembered the men who laughed when Lydia was led away in chains. Ruth, Josiah, Lydia, names Harriet carried like stones in her chest. There were others too. Samuel, a boy who once played with Harriet near the creek, catching minnows with bare hands. He tried to run at 16. They caught him, whipped him until flesh hung in strips, then hung him from a tree for all to see. Harriet could still smell the blood in the air, could still hear the flies buzzing. Samuel's body swayed in the wind for 2 days before they cut him down. "This is the price of freedom," Master Rix had said. Harriet never forgot. Even small cruelties carved themselves deep. She remembers Elijah Carter's laugh as he kicked over a bucket of water she had carried half a mile. She remembers Rufus Boyd spitting into her food before she was forced to serve it to others. She remembers Thomas Ewing making her kneel in the dirt for hours just to amuse his guests. Each act was meant to break her. Each act built the fire instead. Not all memory was pain. Some was love. Harriet remembered Hester, the old healer, teaching her the secrets of roots and leaves, how to chew willow bark for pain, how to brew teas for fever. And one day, when Harriet was 17, Hester leaned close and whispered, "What heals can also kill. Remember that. Someday you may need it." Harriet never forgot. She remembered the smell of Jimson weed flowers blooming in the fields, sweet and poisonous. She remembered the feel of foxglove leaves, soft but deadly. She remembered how nightshade berries gleamed like drops of ink, beautiful but fatal. These plants grew all around the plantations, ignored by men who only saw profit in tobacco. But Harriet saw weapons disguised as weeds. The wounds of the past weren't only flesh, they were lies. Masters promising kindness, then delivering cruelty. Overseers speaking of God, then wielding the lash. Planters toasting brotherhood while tearing families apart. Harriet learned early. Every promise was a blade. Years piled on. Work deepened. Harriet's body hardened. She became skilled in the kitchen, praised for her bread, her stews, her roasted meats. Planters trusted her with food because they never imagined she could wield it as power. They called her Quiet Harriet. They said she had no fire. But silence is not emptiness. Silence is waiting. At night, when the cabins lay quiet, Harriet stared at the ceiling and recited the names: Josiah, Ruth, Lydia, Samuel. She repeated them like prayers, like spells. Each name was a wound. Each wound demanded a reckoning. The chapel became the center of those memories. Sunday service, where masters sang of mercy while hands were still bloody. Harriet polished those pews, scrubbed the floor where their boots trampled, cooked the bread they blessed. Every Sunday, she felt the hypocrisy like poison on her tongue. And one Sunday, she decided the poison would not stay in her. It would pass to them, but not yet. She waited. She gathered. She remembered. Every scar, every name, every betrayal. The past did not break her. The past sharpened her. There is always a final straw, always a moment when the dam cracks, when silence can no longer hold. For Harriet, that moment came not with a lash, but with a prayer. It was late summer of 1843. The sun beat down like fire across Maryland's fields. Tobacco leaves shimmered heavy with sap. Sweat rolled down the backs of enslaved men and women bent double in the rows. The cicadas screamed so loud it felt like the air itself was cracking. Harriet worked in the kitchen, grinding corn into meal, her hands raw. The air smelled of dust, of hog fat sizzling, of sweat soaked into fabric. Elijah Carter entered, boots striking the floor with arrogance. His gold watch glinted in the light. He wasn't angry. He wasn't drunk. He was calm. And sometimes calmness is worse. He leaned against the doorframe, chewing tobacco, and said in a voice cold as iron, "Harriet, your sister Lydia's gone south. Don't look for her. Don't ask. She's property. She ain't yours no more." He smiled as he said it, a smile meant to remind her of power. A smile meant to break what was left of her heart. Harriet didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just kept grinding the corn, stone against stone, powder filling the bowl. But inside, something broke. The sound of the grinding became the sound of bone breaking. The smell of cornmeal became the smell of blood. The rhythm of her hands became the rhythm of rage. That night she lay awake in the cabin. The others slept, breath shallow, bodies exhausted. But Harriet's eyes burned in the dark. Lydia's face hovered before her. Josiah's cough echoed in her ears. Ruth's scarred back. Samuel's body swaying from the tree. The faces of 11 planters floated above them all, grinning. Elijah Carter. James Holloway, Rufus Boyd, Daniel Pike, John Travis, Caleb Boone, Nathaniel Reeves, Samuel Drake, Thomas Ewing, Gideon Hall, William Ricks, names like stones pressing her chest. She whispered to herself, "One for every name. One for every wound." That was the night she made her decision. No more waiting. No more silent endurance. Silence had carried her this far, but silence was not enough. Silence had to be weaponized. The days that followed became preparation. Harriet studied every movement, every habit of the men who ruled her life. She watched Elijah Carter sip cider after service, wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief. She watched James Holloway's greedy hands reaching for bread. She watched Caleb Boone licking stew from his spoon, sweat dripping down his temples. She watched and memorized, not with the eyes of a servant, but with the eyes of a hunter. Tools. She needed tools, but not blades or guns. Those would never pass unnoticed. Her weapons had to be invisible. Her weapons had to be trusted. And so she turned to the plants. At dusk, when the fields emptied, she slipped to the edges of the woods. She bent low, plucking nightshade berries glistening like ink in the twilight. She dug up foxglove roots, their pale fingers curling in the dirt. She gathered Jimson weed, its white trumpet flowers opening under the moon. She wrapped them in cloth, carried them back hidden in her apron. In the cabin at night, while others slept, she ground them on the stone, the same way she had ground corn. Stone against stone, powder rising in the air, bitter on her tongue. She tested small amounts, learning the line between sickness and death. She whispered as she worked. Not for healing. For reckoning. The kitchen became her forge. The pots weren't for cooking. The pestle wasn't for herbs. The cups weren't for thirst. Every object took on new meaning. Every object became part of her plan. And with every motion she changed. She no longer thought of herself as Harriet the servant. She thought of herself as Harriet the shadow. Harriet the silence. Harriet the reckoning. The breaking point wasn't just anger. It was clarity. A vision of 11 men sitting in a row sipping poison they could never see. A vision of their bodies trembling, their lips foaming, their pride collapsing. A vision of memory becoming justice. She rehearsed in her mind. The trays balanced in her arms. The cups filled. The men bowing their heads to pray. Her hands steady as she served them death. No hesitation. No fear. The Sunday service loomed closer. Every day felt like thunder building on the horizon. Harriet spoke little. Her eyes gave nothing away. She cooked, scrubbed, carried, as she always had. But inside, her heart beat like a drum. Then, 3 days before the service, came the spark that sealed her resolve. She was scrubbing the chapel floor, knees pressed to the wood, rags soaked with lye. Gideon Hall walked in, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. He sneered down at her. "You missed a spot, girl," he said, and kicked the bucket over, spilling water across her hands. The lye burned her skin. She winced but stayed silent. Gideon laughed, turned, and walked away. That was it. That was the last wound. The final mark on a body already covered in scars. Harriet sat back on her heels, her burned hands trembling, and whispered under her breath, "Enough." She looked around the chapel. The pews, the altar, the pulpit, the place where they sang of mercy while showing none. She saw it not as a house of God, but as a tomb waiting to be filled. That night she prepared the powders for the last time. She wrapped them carefully, small bundles hidden in her dress. She touched each one as if it were a name: Josiah, Ruth, Lydia, Samuel. Each powder a memory, each memory a weapon. The morning of September 17th arrived. Dawn broke red over the fields, sky bleeding into earth. Harriet rose early, her body calm, her heart still. She dressed in her plain cloth dress, tied her apron and carried her bundle. She felt no fear, only clarity, because Harriet was no longer a servant. She was the storm, and the storm was ready to break. The chapel that September morning smelled faintly of beeswax candles, cedar beams, and starch-heavy collars pressed into suffocating obedience. The men sat lined in their pews, voices lifted in unsteady hymn. 11 planters, each a land baron in his own right, each accustomed to kneeling only before God, never before those who labored under their command. Harriet moved silently along the edges of the space, her presence absorbed like dust in sunlight. To them she was invisible, just another servant, another hand carrying trays, another shadow blending with wood and stone. Yet to herself, Harriet was no longer shadow. She was fire. She was the knife edge that could no longer be dulled. Each face turned upward toward the pulpit belonged to a man who had carved scars into her body or the bodies of those she loved. She saw in them not worship but hypocrisy. She remembered Carter's hand gripping the back of her neck when she was just 12, forcing her to scrub until her fingers bled. She remembered Boyd striking her brother with an iron poker when he faltered in the fields. She remembered Reeves taking her firstborn son from her arms and selling him south without a second glance. These were not simply planters, they were executioners, cloaked in the false piety of prayer. The minister's voice carried hollow through the chamber. "Let us bow our heads, brothers, for the mercy of the Lord." Harriet lowered her gaze, but inside she felt no mercy. Her apron carried the cloth-wrapped bundle she had prepared the night before, herbs boiled down to a thick black extract, bitter to the tongue, undetectable once stirred into the wine. A root taught to her by an elder woman long since buried without a marker. "Use this," the woman had whispered years before. "It will not bring them back, but it will make them fall." Harriet never forgot, and today at last her hands remembered. The pews creaked as the men bent forward, foreheads pressed to fists. Harriet moved then, each step a careful measure. She poured the cups with solemnity, the red liquid swirling like dark blood beneath dim light. Her hands did not shake. They were steady in a way that surprised even her. The poison slid easily, dissolving into the crimson tide, unseen, unheard, unimagined. One by one she carried the trays down the aisle. Shoes scraped as the planters shifted. Holloway whispered something crude to Pike, and they chuckled beneath their breath. Gideon Hall coughed into a handkerchief, old lungs rattling but proud. Caleb Boone tapped his boot impatiently, as if even prayer were a burden when prophets awaited. 11 cups. 11 hands reaching without hesitation. 11 men who believed themselves untouchable. The minister blessed the communion. Bread was broken, dipped, consumed. The wine passed from hand to hand. Lips pressed, throats swallowed. Silence followed. Just the faint buzz of a fly circling the window pane. The echo of wood groaning beneath weight. Harriet stood by the wall, hands clasped, eyes lowered. Inside her chest, her heart was a drumbeat so loud she feared it might betray her. But no one looked. No one cared. Minutes passed. Then came the first cough. Ricks shifted uncomfortably in his seat, dabbing at his lips with a kerchief. Travis reached for his stomach. Boyd's laughter died mid-breath, replaced by a grimace. One by one, discomfort spread like a ripple across water. The hymn faltered. The minister's voice broke off. 11 faces turned pale. 11 pairs of hands trembled. "What is this?" Reeves barked, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by bile rising fast. Panic crept into the room. Boone staggered to his feet, clutching his chest. Holloway tried to stand, but his knees buckled. Carter fell forward onto the pew, gasping for air. The chapel filled with a symphony of choking, wheezing, retching, a grotesque hymn no choir would ever sing. Harriet did not move. She watched. Her eyes, unreadable all her life, now blazed with a terrible clarity. This was not madness. This was not accident. This was history writing itself with bitter ink, and she its author. Men who had once commanded armies of enslaved bodies now writhed helplessly, their fine coats stained with sweat and vomit. Their cries filled the sacred space, echoing against the rafters, and for the first time in years, Harriet felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The silence of her life cracked open into a roar, unheard by them but ringing through her very bones. The minister dropped to his knees, crossing himself, whispering frantic prayers. But no prayer could cleanse the wine. No mercy could soften Harriet's resolve. When at last their voices weakened, when groans turned to whimpers and bodies slumped into stillness, Harriet turned and walked away. She did not run. She did not look back. Her footsteps were steady, her breath even. For once, she was not invisible. For once, her silence had spoken louder than their power. That Sunday morning, in a small chapel of cedar beams and fading hymns, 11 men drank from a cup they believed holy. But Harriet had written a different kind of scripture, one in which the oppressed became the author, and the oppressors became the footnotes. And in that moment, history shifted quietly, violently, irreversibly. The air inside the chapel grew heavy, thick with the stench of bile, sweat, and smoke from the guttering candles. The 11 men who had once filled the space with booming voices and commands now lay collapsed across pews and floorboards, their fine coats crumpled, their mouths foaming, their bodies jerking with spasms that looked almost like convulsions of prayer gone wrong. For a long moment, Harriet stood at the threshold, her hand resting against the cool wood of the doorframe. She listened, not to hymns, not to orders, not to the crack of a whip, but to the sound of dying men gasping in disbelief. It was a sound she thought she might remember all her life, etched deeper than any lash upon her back. The minister knelt beside Gideon Hall, tears streaking his weathered face. "Lord, forgive us! Lord, forgive us!" he cried, pressing trembling hands against Hall's chest as if to hold the life in. But the Lord did not intervene. Hall's body convulsed once more, then went still. Others followed. Boone groaned and clawed at the pew until his fingernails split. Reeves staggered halfway to the altar before collapsing like a felled oak. Drake's lips turned a bluish-gray as his breath rattled, then ceased. 11 men, all pillars of the county's wealth, were reduced to shuddering flesh and silence. And Harriet? She felt neither guilt nor triumph in that first stillness. What she felt was something else, an unsettling calm, as though the storm she had carried for decades had finally broken and left her in its hollow eye. But outside the chapel, the world was not calm. Field hands and kitchen servants had heard the shouts. A few crept closer, peering through cracked doors and windows. When they saw the planters sprawled lifeless on the floor, whispers spread like wind through cane and tobacco fields. They are dead. The masters are dead. Fear followed close behind wonder. For every whisper of freedom came the dread of what white retaliation would mean. An overseer still living on another estate. Militia riding in from the county seat. Punishment reigned not only on the guilty, but on the innocent. And in Maryland of 1843, innocence mattered little if one's skin bore the mark of slavery. Harriet knew this. She had not acted in ignorance of consequence. She knew the world outside those walls would not call her a liberator. They would call her a murderer, a demon, a cautionary tale. And yet she also knew this. The lash had never spared her innocence. So why should she spare theirs? She walked out of the chapel with her head lifted higher than she had ever dared before. The autumn sun, pale and unforgiving, poured across her face. Every step she took across the dirt path was a step she chose, not one commanded. For the first time, her feet felt like they belonged to her. Behind her, the minister's wails continued, a chorus of grief and fury. Soon word would spread to the county. The bodies of the 11 would be laid out for wives and sons to mourn, and Harriet's name would rise not in blessing but in curses. Yet even in that certainty she felt unburdened. For what is a reckoning if not truth, long denied, finally spoken aloud? The truth was this. The men had lived by cruelty, and cruelty had returned to them. The truth was that Harriet had been shaped by their violence, but she had refused to be ended by it. The truth was that history would not remember her as they wished, a faceless servant, silent and small, but as the woman who brought 11 planters to their knees on a Sunday morning in Maryland. As she walked past the fields, laborers lifted their heads. Some froze in terror, uncertain whether to bow or flee. Others stared wide-eyed, mouths open, as if they beheld not a woman but an omen. Harriet gave them no signal, no explanation. The deed was done, and each man and woman would carry its meaning in their own way. By the time Harriet reached the edge of the estate, distant bells were tolling. Not the soft summons to worship, but the harsh clamor of alarm. Word had spread. Riders would come. Dogs would be loosed. The law would sharpen its noose. Yet Harriet did not run, not yet. She stood upon the hill overlooking the land she had once labored on, and for a single breath, she allowed herself to imagine something she had never dared. A world where her children would not be sold, where her back would not be scarred, where her name would not be a whisper but a fire. Whether she would live to see that world did not matter. What mattered was that, for a single Sunday in 1843, she had cracked the spine of power, if only for a moment, and that moment would echo. The reckoning had come not only for 11 planters but for Harriet herself. She turned from the estate, from the chapel, from the dead. Each step forward was uncertain, but it was hers. And in the stillness of the September air, the earth seemed to hold its breath, because what Harriet had done was not simply an act of vengeance. It was a message. The age of silence was ending. The bodies lay cold on wooden pews, their mouths slack, their hands curled like claws. Wax from the altar candles dripped onto the floorboards, mingling with spittle and blood. The chapel smelled of sickness, vinegar, and smoke. It was no longer a house of God. It was a crypt. By evening, wives arrived with sons and brothers, faces pale as they crossed the threshold. Cries rose like storm winds, shaking the rafters. The name Harriet passed from one grieving mouth to another, carried with venom, disbelief, and terror. "She served in my kitchen," Mrs. Boone cried, her hair half loosed from its pins. "I saw her stirring the pots with her own hands. She passed bread to my husband not 2 nights past," another moaned. The 11 planters had been men of wealth, land, and cruelty. Their deaths were not small losses. Their deaths meant power had been struck at its root, and the county would not forgive it. Within hours, riders thundered down dirt lanes, spreading word from estate to estate. Torches were lit. Bells tolled not in worship but in warning. Slaves were rounded up, questioned under whip and threat. Overseers shouted until their throats bled. Who helped her? Who else drank poison? Who else carries it still? Fear rippled through the cabins. Some swore they had never spoken to Harriet beyond necessity. Others whispered of her silence, her still eyes, her way of listening. Some prayed for her, some cursed her name, afraid of the punishment her act would bring upon them all. The law moved swiftly. Wanted notices spread across Maryland's counties. Harriet, Negro woman, dangerous poisoner. Height near 5 feet. Scar above right wrist. Silent tongue. Suspected of murdering 11 planters of Dorchester County. Reward, $500 for capture, alive or dead. Slave catchers sharpened knives, adjusted nooses, saddled horses. But Harriet had vanished into the woods. The pines closed around her like sentinels. She walked barefoot across roots and stones, her hands torn by brambles, her body fueled by something stronger than food, the need to remain free long enough to know the weight of what she had done. By rivers she knelt, splashing cool water against her skin. By night she wrapped herself in branches, listening to owls cry. Every sound in the dark could be hoofbeats. Every gust of wind could be dogs. And yet, for the first time, fear did not feel like chains. Fear felt like proof that she was still alive. Days bled into nights. Hunger hollowed her. Sleep dragged her down like stones, but memory kept her walking. Memory of Jonas, her brother, sold south. Memory of Ruth, her sister, whipped until her back split like cracked bark. Memory of her mother's trembling hands when Harriet was taken into Hall's kitchen. Memory of silence forced upon her for years until silence itself became her weapon. The county seethed. Churches thundered sermons of wrath. "The devil walks among us in the shape of a black woman," one minister cried. This is what happens when kindness is extended to savages. Kindness. That was the word they used for feeding scraps after 12 hours in the field. Kindness. That was the word for letting a child live after beating its mother half to death. Kindness, they called it. Harriet called it chains gilded with lies. Her story spread beyond the county, whispered by travelers, carried in broadsheets. Some told it as horror, proof of the danger lurking in dark kitchens. Others told it in hushed admiration, proof that even those born in chains could strike back. In cabins by candlelight, slaves repeated her name like a secret prayer. Harriet, Harriet of Maryland. Some swore her spirit walked beside them, silent and watching. Mothers told their children, "Remember, silence can be sharper than a blade." But white vengeance was merciless. For weeks, patrols stormed the quarters, searching for contraband, beating confessions out of trembling men. Several were hanged for no crime but knowing her name. Still, Harriet was not found. One night, under a sky swollen with stars, she reached the banks of the Choptank River. The water shimmered dark, wide, endless. On the far side lay marshes, and beyond them whispers said safe houses of Quakers who hid fugitives. She stood at the edge, bare toes sinking into mud, the night air biting her skin. She thought of the chapel. She thought of the 11. She thought of the cries that must still echo inside those walls, and then she stepped forward into the water. The current pulled at her, cold and strong, dragging at her legs, at her waist. She did not cry. She did not scream. She just pressed forward, mouth set, eyes fixed on the far shore. Every stroke was a name: Jonas, Ruth, mother, father. Every breath was a vow that silence would not be her end. When she crawled out on the other side, shivering, half-drowned, she pressed her palms to the earth and whispered, not to God, not to saints, but to the memory of those who had been taken. She whispered, I am still here. The aftermath was not gentle. Her story would become fractured, told in court records, in plantation journals, in fireside warnings, in whispered legends. Some would say she was caught within months and hanged beneath a courthouse tree. Others would say she reached the north, carried by hands willing to risk everything. Others still would claim she vanished into the swamps, becoming more ghost than woman. But in every telling, the truth beat like a drum. 11 men lay dead on a Sunday morning, and it was Harriet who fed them the final sacrament. The chapel where it happened would never again feel holy. Its floorboards remembered too much. The county's fields would never again feel entirely safe. Overseers twitched at the sight of every kitchen hand, wondering what herbs, what powders, what silences hid in their gaze. And across Maryland, the name Harriet became both curse and prayer. The aftermath was this: power had been cracked. Even if only for a moment, it had been proven that the whip was not invincible, that chains could rattle and break, that silence could kill. And though Harriet's footsteps faded into woods, rivers, or gallows, the sound of them never truly stopped. Because once a reckoning begins, it does not end with the dead. It lingers in the living. It lingers in us. The year was 1843, but the echo of that Sunday morning would not remain trapped in the wooden beams of a Maryland chapel. It would seep outward, through dirt roads, through county courthouses, through whispers around firelight. Harriet's name refused to stay buried. The planters' widows spoke it like venom. To them she was a serpent in the kitchen, a devil in plain sight. In their telling, she had tricked the good Christian men of Dorchester, poisoning the bread of fellowship. They painted her as cunning, unnatural, a reminder that slaves were not only labor but danger. The law recorded her name with ink and bile. Harriet, Negro woman, property of Hall Estate, suspected poisoner, fugitive. To the men who signed the warrants, she was not a woman at all. She was evidence of chaos, an example to be made, a threat to order. But in the cabins and fields, her name spread differently. There Harriet became a drumbeat, a whisper between mothers rocking children to sleep. Remember Harriet, a tale told by old men with scarred backs, warning that silence could be sharper than steel. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just acted. Her name was spoken with awe and fear because the act was bigger than one woman. It was proof that the kitchen spoon, the humble herb, the unseen silence, all could bring down men who thought themselves untouchable. It was proof that slavery was not submission without end, but a fire waiting for air. The story grew as stories do. Some said Harriet was captured and hanged, her body swinging from a courthouse tree while planters cheered. They said the dogs tore her dress, and she never made a sound even as the rope bit into her throat. Others swore she escaped across the river, that Quakers carried her north under stars, that she found freedom in a cold city and lived out her days in quiet defiance. And then there were those who believed she never left the swamps at all, that Harriet lived on in the marshes of Maryland, unseen but not gone, a shadow that reminded every planter who crossed the fields that death could come from the very hands that served them supper. The truth was never written clean. History prefers its heroes neat, its villains obvious. Harriet was neither. She was a slave woman who lost too much, who bent in silence until silence became her strength, who chose poison over prayer, reckoning over obedience. But whether caught or free, whether hanged or hidden, her act could not be erased. In Maryland's counties, kitchens changed. Planters watched every hand more closely. Overseers sniffed every pot. Food tasters were demanded, and suspicion poisoned every meal. Trust between master and servant cracked like dry wood. And fear. Fear lived not only in the cabins but in the great houses, too. That was Harriet's true legacy, not only 11 dead planters, but the knowledge that none of their kind could ever be fully safe again. Years passed. The nation crept closer to its own breaking point. Newspapers filled with talk of abolition, of fugitive slaves, of uprisings in far-off places. And somewhere among those words, Harriet's story appeared, sometimes in truth, sometimes in twisted fragments. An abolitionist pamphlet carried her tale as a warning. This is what slavery breeds. If you sow cruelty, do not be shocked when you reap blood. And even after the Civil War, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, her story lived on in the margins. Not in statues or sermons, but in whispers. She was not made into a saint, not folded into polite history. She was too sharp, too dangerous, too real. Yet in every dangerous story lies a seed of freedom. Harriet's name was passed down through families who had nothing else to hold on to. A grandmother might tell a child, "Once there was a woman in Maryland who would not bow. Remember her when you feel small." A man might hum her story while sharpening a blade, not to kill but to remind himself that power could be cut. And today, when we look back at 1843, when we hear the faint toll of those chapel bells and smell the bitter herbs stirred into stew, we know Harriet was more than a murderer, more than a fugitive. She was a truth the planters could never silence, that even those born in chains carried the fire of reckoning in their bones. She did not cry. She did not beg. She just acted. The chapel still stands in Dorchester County, though its pews are worn and its windows clouded with age. Tourists pass by, unaware of the blood-soaked Sunday it once held. But if you step inside when the sun is low, you may feel it, the weight of silence heavier than song, the memory of footsteps that once carried poison instead of prayer. Harriet's legacy is not in stone or scripture. It is in the uneasy shiver of power whenever it grows too cruel, in the reminder that no master sleeps without fear once silence has been broken. If this story lingers with you, if it burns in your chest like a wound and a warning, it is because Harriet's silence was never truly hers alone. It belongs to history. It belongs to memory. It belongs to us. And when we say her name now, we do not say it in fear. We say it as testament. Harriet of Maryland, the woman who poisoned 11 planters during Sunday service 1843. The reckoning in flesh and silence, the story that refuses to die.